Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is something deeply, cosmically unsettling about a creature that does not know how to be afraid. Think about that for a moment. Really sit with it. Because in a universe as brutally unforgiving as Warhammer 40,000, fear is not a weakness. Fear is information. Fear is the quiet voice in the back of your skull that says, "This thing will kill you, and you should consider running." Every single species in the 41st millennium has learned to listen to that voice at least some of the time. The Eldari, with all their grace and psychic mastery, fear the slow extinction of their people. The Tau, for all their optimism about the greater good, fear the crushing weight of forces that do not negotiate. Even the servants of the Chaos gods, wreathed in demonic power and the warping influence of the Imperium, have things that make them pause. Traitor legions, who walked through entire battlefields without hesitation, will still hesitate at the edge of something that doesn't follow any rule they understand. Fear is universal. Fear is the great equalizer. And then there are the Orks. The Orks are perhaps the most genuinely, authentically fearless species in the entire Milky Way galaxy. Not reckless, not suicidal, not numb to pain through chemical or spiritual means. Genuinely, biologically, psychically constituted to be incapable of the kind of deep, bone-cold terror that stops other creatures in their tracks. Their entire society is built on the premise that the most dangerous thing in any given situation is worth fighting, and the universe keeps producing bigger and more dangerous things. And this is fine because bigger dangers just mean a bigger fight, and a bigger fight means a better day. Their very physiology reflects this. An orc can take wounds that would kill a space marine and keep fighting on pure instinct and momentum. Their bodies heal at a rate that borders on the miraculous. Limbs can be reattached, organs can be replaced with crude machinery, and functional enough muscle memory that the orc in question barely misses a beat. An orc whose skull has been partially caved in by an enemy weapon has been known to simply get back up, shake the pieces of its own cranium out of what remains of its scalp, and rejoin the fight with renewed enthusiasm for the being who managed to hit it that hard. Orc culture celebrates strength in a way that goes beyond mere philosophy. It is literally written into their genetics. The bigger a greenskin gets, the more authority it commands. Here, the more brutally effective a warlord proves itself, the more other orcs are magnetically drawn to its gathering momentum. The great warlord migrations, those galaxy-shaking cascades of violence and momentum that the greenskins call their great crusades of battle, begin because enough orcs have gathered in one place, seen one warboss prove himself properly unstoppable, and simply decided that following that standard of violence is the closest thing to a religious experience that their species can articulate. They do not fear death. They do not fear pain. They do not fear losing, not in any existential sense, because the concept of permanent loss does not really register when you reproduce through spores, and your dead contribute to the next generation of fighters. When orcs die, orcs grow. But an orc empire cannot be exterminated by killing orcs, only by sterilizing the very soil they fell on, burning it down to bare rock, and even then the answer is uncertain. This is why the orc question has kept imperial generals awake for 10,000 years. You cannot frighten them off. You cannot demoralize them. You cannot negotiate with them. You cannot make them understand that what they are doing is hopeless, because hopelessness requires a belief in outcomes, and orcs do not really believe in outcomes so much as they believe in the present moment of violence and the satisfaction it provides. The Eldar, in their ancient and exhausted wisdom, have described the orc as something close to a force of nature, not a civilization making choices, but a biological expression of the universe's desire to fight itself. And yet, there is one corner of the galaxy where orc crusades simply do not go. One region that, despite containing worlds and resources, and presumably very satisfying things to fight, sits largely empty of the thundering boots and grinding machines of the greenskin horde. One area where, if you look at the maps carefully enough and trace the warbands that regularly sweep through the eastern fringe and the segmentum ultima and all those wild, distant stars, you notice a conspicuous absence. Not just an absence of Orc settlement, though that is there too, but an absence of Orc presence, of incursion, of the casual drive-by violence that characterizes greenskin expansion. As if something out there, something in those cold, faintly glowing systems on the absolute northeastern edge of the known galaxy, gave the Orcs pause, made them, and in their wordless, instinct-driven way, decide that some fights are not worth having. This region has a name. It is one of the most evocative, bone-chilling, quietly terrible names in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. It is a name that even the most hardened navigators whisper with something approaching reverence, or perhaps more accurately, approaching dread. The Ghoul stars. Tonight, we are going down into those stars together. We are going to walk through the dead systems and the failing suns and the ruins of civilizations that no longer have anyone to mourn them. We are going to meet the things that live there, the things that defied 11 entire Space Marine chapters and swept across sectors like a pale and unstoppable tide. We are going to understand what waits in the dark at the edge of everything, and why the Imperium keeps an entire Space Marine chapter stationed out there simply to make sure that darkness does not creep inward, and why even the greenskins, with all their bottomless appetite for violence, have apparently looked northeast and decided to keep looking south. Get comfortable, take a breath, you're going to need it. But before we go, before we step across that invisible line on the galactic map where the Imperium stops confidently naming things and starts writing, "Here be horrors," in the margins, let us spend just a moment more with the Orcs. Because the Orc question is not just a convenient hook, it is the emotional and thematic center of this entire story. The Orcs have, throughout their billions of years' history, wandered into almost every terrible place the galaxy has to offer. They have fought the Tyranids and found it a good time. They have walked into the Eye of Terror, the literal tear in reality where the Chaos Gods live, where the rules of physics are replaced by the rules of madness, and declared it worth fighting in. The legendary greenskin warlord known as Tusker the Daemon Killer liked fighting demons so much that when Khorne himself noticed and had the entire warband dragged into the blood god's own domain, condemned to fight and die and be reborn to fight again for all eternity, the Orcs reportedly considered this an excellent outcome. They are in a demonic realm, being perpetually killed by bloodthirsters and apparently having the time of their immortal unlife. These are the Orcs. These are the beings who look at the Eye of Terror and see a venue. These are the warriors who view the discovery of a new Space Marine chapter as promising news about potential opponents. These are the creatures whose response to the Tyranid hive mind, a collective psychic intelligence that commands the most adaptive and relentless killing machines in the galaxy, was essentially fantastic. Bring it. And they stay away from the Ghoul stars. That is not nothing. That is not a small thing. That is, in the vocabulary of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, the equivalent of the most violence-addicted species in creation politely declining an invitation. The data speaks without needing interpretation. The greenskins are everywhere. They have settled worlds in the galactic north and south, worlds in the deep segmentum obscurus, worlds on the edge of the Eye of Terror. They have domains and empires and wandering warbands that cover the galaxy like a persistent and hard-to-remove green rash, except in one place. The one place that, whatever the Orcs instinctively measure when they measure danger, reads as something other than a good fight. So now you understand why we are here. Now you understand why the Ghoul stars deserve our full and careful attention, not because they are the most dramatic location in the setting. The Eye of Terror has them beat on sheer scale of active horror, not because they are the most militarily contested. The Cadian Gate has been the site of more Space Marine blood than any one region can easily contain. The Ghoul stars deserve our attention because they are the place that makes the Orcs hesitate. And anything that can do that has earned the right to be understood on its own terms. Section 2. The Geography of Dread, where the Astronomicon goes silent. Before we can understand what lives in the Ghoul stars, we need to understand where they are and why that location matters more than almost anything else about them. The Warhammer 40,000 galaxy is vast in a way that human language genuinely struggles to capture. Tens of thousands of inhabited worlds, hundreds of billions of lives spread across the great arms of the Milky Way, hundreds of space marine chapters deployed across different regions, each covering an area that, if you looked at it from outside the setting, would span distances that defy easy comprehension. And yet, for all that vastness, the Imperium of man maintains something like coherence, something like order, because of a single blazing psychic lighthouse anchored on the surface of terror itself, the Astronomicon. The Astronomicon is a psychic beacon of incomprehensible power, maintained by the Emperor of mankind sitting on his golden throne. It blazes outward across the galaxy like a light in the dark, guiding the navigators of Imperial ships through the treacherous unreality of the warp. Without the Astronomicon, warp travel becomes extraordinarily dangerous. Navigators, already rare mutants born with a psychic third eye that allows them to perceive the immaterium and steer through it, lose their primary reference point. Travel becomes slower, riskier, and increasingly likely to end in the kind of way that produces no survivors and no records. The Astronomicon is not merely convenient. It is the spine of the Imperium. Remove it, and the vast web of trade routes, supply lines, military deployments, and communication networks that hold 1 million worlds together simply collapses. The Ghoul stars sit in the extreme northeast of the Milky Way galaxy, beyond the furthest reaches of the Ultima Segmentum and past the eastern fringe. And crucially, they sit almost entirely beyond the effective range of the Astronomicon. The beacon's light reaches everywhere inside the great imperial heartlands with brilliant clarity, and it grows fainter as you travel outward, but remains workable for experienced navigators through most of the eastern fringe. But the Ghoul stars, out there, navigators describe the Astronomicon as barely a whisper, a suggestion, a trembling candle viewed through deep fog from the other side of a continent. Getting to the Ghoul stars via the warp is already an undertaking that experienced void captains approach with the kind of careful, meticulous preparation normally reserved for battles they expect to lose. Getting deeper into the Ghoul stars, into the true interior of that dread region rather than its borders, requires a level of navigation that borders on the suicidal. There is a particular intimacy to navigating without the Astronomicon that no one who has not attempted it can quite appreciate. Most navigators spend their careers working with the beacon as a constant companion, not just a tool, but a presence, a warmth in the psychic dark, the feeling of knowing where you are because there is something fixed to measure yourself against. The Astronomicon is the universe confirming its own structure. When it fades, and when the whisper becomes silence, and the silence becomes the kind of absolute dark that has no color even in the imagination, the navigator is left with only their own perception and skill, and whatever small talent they have for feeling the shape of the warp, without anything external to guide them. Experienced navigators, who have pushed into the Ghoul stars, describe the experience in language that varies from the clinical to the confessional, but the consistent thread is the weight of the silence. Not the absence of sound in the physical sense. Void ships are not quiet places. Their machinery and crew, and the subtle mechanical voice of a working starship filling every available silence with functional noise. The weight of the psychic silence. The feeling of being the only light in a room so large you cannot find the walls. And then there is this sobering fact, recorded without editorializing in the Imperial Chronicles. No expedition has ever returned from the deep regions of the Ghoul stars. Not one. Not a single survey mission. Not a single rogue trader fleet carrying letters of marque, and the kind of reckless ambition that drives humans to the furthest edges of the void. Not a single space marine strike force, sent to probe the interior. They have all gone in. None have come back. There are no survivors to debrief, no distress signals received before the signals themselves were consumed by whatever waits out there, no scattered debris tumbling back toward the safe edges of the galaxy to tell even a partial story. The Ghoul stars take and do not return. Now, stand in a system on the periphery of the Ghoul stars for a moment and look around. The light that reaches you from the local stars is different from the light of healthy, vigorous stellar objects. The Ghoul stars are named for a reason. These are dying suns, old stars past the midpoint of their stellar life cycles, burning with a cooler and more distant light. Red and orange giants, cooler yellow-white stars slowly losing their cohesion, stellar objects that have been burning for so long that the ancient processes that produce the vigorous blue-white brilliance of younger systems have guttered down to something more measured, more patient, and somehow more menacing. Under the light of a dying sun, everything looks a little washed out, a little pale. The shadows fall differently. A world orbiting such a star would be dimmer than it should be, colder perhaps, or heated in uneven ways, depending on the variability of the old star it circles. The worlds themselves carry the evidence of something ancient. These systems were once inhabited by humans. Before the age of strife, before the psychic calamity that severed the old stellar empire of humanity into isolated pockets and drove those already isolated pockets to war with one another, there were people here, cities, whatever passed for civilization in this remote corner of space. Archaeological evidence, when anyone has managed to reach and examine these worlds, suggests the presence of human settlement. The ruins of structures whose design does not match any modern imperial architectural style. The chemical signatures of agricultural terraforming in the soil of dead worlds. The faint ghost of ancient settlement patterns that become visible when orbital surveys sweep across the right kind of barren plain. They are all dead. Every single one. The human civilizations of the Ghoul stars were wiped out long before the Imperium existed, long before the armies of the Emperor swept outward on their great crusade, long before even the worst of the Age of Strife's horrors reached these border systems. Something came through here before all of that. Something took its time and went from world to world, system to system, and removed every living thing from every human-settled planet it touched. The dead worlds it left behind are not the result of war, or not war alone. They are sterile, scoured, cleaned down to the bedrock in many places, as if whatever came through was not merely trying to kill the humans who lived there, but was trying to eliminate all evidence that anything had ever thrived on these surfaces. What was it? We will come back to that. We will come back to it in some detail, because understanding what reduced the human settlements of the Ghoul stars to silence and stone is one of the most important pieces of this entire story. For now, just hold that image in your mind. A vast region of space full of worlds that should have humans on them, that were prepared for humans, that show every sign of having once supported human life, and that are instead empty. Not war-torn and eventually resettled, not depopulated by plague and waiting for colony ships, but gone, utterly and completely gone, in a way that left no one to explain what happened. And in the ruins, in the pale light of those old and tired stars, other things moved in to fill the space. Section 3. Dead Worlds and the Silence Before History. The question of what killed the human civilizations of the Ghoul stars does not have a clean answer. The Imperium has never been able to fully investigate, partly because of the navigational dangers, and partly because the Inquisition and other bodies within the Adeptus Terra have a habit of suppressing information about the Ghoul stars that goes beyond strictly operational necessity. Records get sealed, reports get filed in vaults that only the highest clearances can access. There are scholars within the broader Imperium who suspect, if they think about this region of space at all, that something happened out there so thoroughly unsettling that the governing bodies of the Imperium would rather nobody knew the full extent of it. But fragments survive. They always do. The 40,000 universe is built on the persistence of records in unexpected places, on the fact that when one archive is destroyed, another had already copied the relevant pages, on the stubbornness of historical truth, to leave traces even when powerful entities would prefer it did not. And what those fragments collectively suggest is genuinely fascinating and genuinely disturbing. One strong candidate for the destroyer of the Ghoul star's human populations is the Crave. The Crave are one of the more obscure predator species of the early Imperium, encountered by the Great Crusade and referred to in the records that were kept from that era. And they are described as creatures that feed on the minds of other beings, not in a metaphorical sense, but a literal one. Psychic parasites that drain sapient minds of their cognitive content, leaving behind husks, and that seem to be drawn to concentrations of human psychic activity, the way a shark is drawn to blood in open water. The Age of Strife, that great psychic catastrophe that preceded the Emperor's unification of Terra, would have produced exactly the kind of immense psychic screaming across the void that would draw the Crave from wherever they were lurking in the outer dark. The concentrated terror and suffering of billions of humans cut off from each other, fighting themselves, and dying in vast numbers. All of that would have been a signal fire visible across enormous distances to any creature that hunted by the taste of mental anguish. The theory goes like this. The Crave, drawn by the psychic noise of the Age of Strife, descended on the already isolated human worlds of the Ghoul stars and simply consumed them. Not quickly, not all at once, but system by system and world by world, following the trail of human habitation, eating until there was nothing left, and then moving on or going dormant. It is not confirmed. Nothing about the deep history of the Ghoul stars is confirmed, because confirming it would require sending a properly equipped expedition into the interior, and those do not come back, but the timing works out. And the nature of the destruction is consistent with what was documented about the Crave wherever the Great Crusade encountered them. There is a cruelty in that theory that compounds the horror. The Age of Strife was itself a catastrophe for humanity. Untold billions died in civil war, in the predations of the supernatural entities that flooded through a suddenly psychically unstable galaxy, in the simple, grinding misery of civilizations cut off from each other without the communication networks that had kept them coherent. The humans of the Ghoul stars would have been experiencing the full force of that catastrophe, frightened and isolated, and probably already dying in significant numbers when the Crave arrived. The psychic noise that attracted the predators was the noise of human suffering. At the same suffering that was drawing them to their deaths was, in that grim irony that the 40,000 universe specializes in, the mechanism by which their deaths accelerated. There is another possibility, or perhaps a companion possibility, because in the 40,000 universe it is rarely a single factor that wipes out a civilization. This universe tends to pile disasters onto each other the way a particularly unhappy cook layers flavors that do not complement each other. The Old Ones, those ancient and enigmatic beings who crafted many of the sentient species of the Milky Way as weapons in their war against the Necrons, had outposts and installations throughout the galaxy, including, according to some fragmentary records and scholarly speculation, in the region that would eventually become the Ghoul stars. Or some of what the Ghoul stars harbor might be the remnant byproducts of the war in heaven, that 60-million-year-old conflict between the Old Ones and the Cetan-driven Necrontyr that rewrote the fundamental rules of existence in the galaxy. Not active threats left over from that war necessarily, but passive ones. Locations where the fabric of reality was strained or damaged by battles that made modern warfare look like a playground argument. Places where physics behaves in ways that are not quite right. Pockets of space where the warp bleeds through in slow and subtle ways that corrupt over geological timescales. The human settlers of the Ghoul stars, arriving in this region during a period of relative galactic stability, before the Age of Strife, would have had no way to perceive these deeper distortions. Yet the wounds left by the war in heaven heal slowly, if they heal at all, and from the surface of a habitable world, the difference between a system with normal warp bleed and one with elevated warp bleed is not immediately obvious. You might notice that psychers on your world produced unusual abilities. You might find that animals native to your planet behaved strangely near certain geographical features, as if something beneath them was disturbing their instincts. You might have subtle difficulties with communications equipment or navigational instruments that you would probably attribute to local stellar interference rather than to the possibility that the local stellar neighborhood was sitting on the scar tissue of a divine war 60 million years old. The slow wrongness would accumulate generation by generation, out until it was simply the way things were, and by then, whatever the accumulated wrongness was doing to the population would have been doing it long enough that there was nothing left to notice. What is interesting is what was not killed in the Ghoul stars. When the human civilizations died, something else moved in, and what moved in was not random. The species we will discuss in the later sections of this exploration are all genuinely alien in ways that go beyond the typical Xenos threat. They are not merely dangerous or hostile. Several of them have been described in the very careful language of Imperial scholars writing with one eye on the Inquisition's censorship apparatus as supernatural. The word supernatural does not appear lightly in official Imperial scholarship. The Imperium has an answer for everything. And chaos is just the warp. Psychic powers are just the manipulation of the immaterium. Xenos are just alien biology, however hostile. But when an Imperial document says supernatural, it means something that the established frameworks of understanding cannot fully account for. The Ghoul stars are home to creatures that seem to exist outside the categories that the Imperium uses to understand the universe. And whatever those creatures are, they apparently had no particular difficulty with the conditions that killed the human colonists. They thrive out there, in the pale light and the navigational darkness, in the dead ruins of what was once a human frontier. They have been there long enough to build civilizations of their own, long enough to become genuinely entrenched in every corner of that remote darkness. Was long enough that the Imperium eventually had to accept that simply ignoring the Ghoul stars was not a sustainable policy. It is important to sit with the scale of this. These are not invaders that arrived recently. These are not refugee populations that stumbled into a depopulated region and settled it out of desperation. The things in the Ghoul stars are indigenous to the darkness that others fear to enter, native to conditions that kill navigators and doom expeditions, built for an environment that was shaped by catastrophes that predate the Imperium by geological eons. They are old in the same way that certain ocean predators are old, not wise, not patient in any human sense, but evolved and adapted to environments so precisely hostile that survival in them is itself a kind of superiority. Something that can live in the Ghoul stars, something that considers the dying light of failing stars and the navigational blackout of a region beyond the Astronomicon to be home, is something that was shaped by conditions that would kill almost anything else. That is what is waiting out there. That is why the expeditions do not come back. Not because the Ghoul stars are merely dangerous, but because they are dangerous in a way specifically calibrated by whatever forces shaped them, to be dangerous to everything that was not born in them. Section 4. The Pale Wasting. The galaxy's most censored conflict. Let us talk about the event that made the Imperium build an entire Space Marine chapter, specifically to stand guard over a single region of space. The Pale Wasting. The name alone has a quality to it. It is not a bold, militaristic name like the Badab War or the Siege of Terror. Yes, it does not announce itself with martial confidence. It whispers. It suggests something that came slowly, that spread, that bleached the life from things the way a deep cold bleaches color. Pale. Wasting. These are words of diminishment and loss, of something that reduces rather than destroys cleanly. The time period is the 34th millennium, in the middle of one of the most turbulent eras of Imperial history. the Nova Terra Interregnum. The Interregnum was the period when the Council of Nova Terra, a governing body in the Segmentum Pacificus, simply refused to acknowledge the authority of the High Lords of Terra and declared themselves a separate empire. This fracture opened up into 9 centuries of civil conflict. Not necessarily constant open warfare, yet but a sustained political and military division that meant the Imperium's attention and resources were perpetually being pulled in multiple directions at once. The Nova Terra Regency, calling itself the true heirs of the Emperor's legacy, the High Lords insisting on the authority of Terra, both sides maneuvering for advantage, while the machinery of imperial governance creaked and strained under the added load. And it was in this moment of institutional division and distracted attention, that something came out of the Ghoul stars. What it was exactly is a question that the historical record deliberately refuses to answer clearly. The documents that survive from this period are fragmentary, not because they were lost, but because they were destroyed. Yet the Inquisition, or some body with the authority to direct the Inquisition, went through the relevant archives with what must have been remarkable thoroughness. They removed records, they sealed reports, they confiscated and quarantined eyewitness accounts from the Space Marine chapters that fought in the resulting campaign. The historians who have attempted to reconstruct the pale wasting from surviving fragments have compared the experience to trying to read a book by the light of what the censors dropped while burning the rest of it. You can see the shape of something. You cannot read the full text. What you can piece together from the fragments that survived and from the occasional oblique reference in records whose authors perhaps did not fully understand what they were describing is this. Something emerged from the Ghoul stars during the 34th millennium and began spreading across imperial space. The surviving descriptions are contradictory in ways that are themselves telling. Some records describe it as a plague, a star-spawned plague, in the exact phrasing used in one of the few official surviving acknowledgements of the event. A disease of some kind, or something that behaved like a disease, spreading from world to world and consuming populations. Scores of worlds went silent. Entire sectors fell out of contact. The kind of loss of life that, in a normal imperial context, would generate thousands of pages of after-action reports and desperate pleas for assistance, simply vanished into the administrative darkness without producing the paper trail that should have followed. But other records describe it differently. These surviving documents talk about nightmare engines, machines, or things that functioned like machines, that moved through sectors and slaughtered populations with industrial efficiency. The language suggests scale, not individual monsters or even small armies, but something that operated at a level capable of killing entire planetary populations within timeframes that border on the geometric. Things that could end a world the way a fire ends a forest, systematically, completely, leaving nothing behind that could restart the growth cycle. The two descriptions, plague and machine, are not necessarily in contradiction. The thing that was called the pale wasting may have had both aspects. It may have spread like an infection while also deploying instruments of physical destruction. Yet it may have operated on multiple levels simultaneously, which would explain why the fragmentary records describing it seem to be talking about different phenomena, but are actually talking about the same event. 12 Space Marine chapters were sent to deal with it. 12 entire chapters. Roughly 10,000 of the finest warriors the Imperium could produce, each a superhuman killing machine clad in power armor and armed with weapons that could reduce a building to rubble from range, each the product of genetic modification and decades of brutal training, each fighting under the banner of their chapter's honor and the Emperor's will. An enormous commitment of the most elite military assets the Imperium possesses, deployed specifically against this one threat from the Ghoul stars. 11 of those chapters were destroyed, not depleted, not badly damaged and forced to withdraw, destroyed. 11 Space Marine chapters, each with their own histories and battle honors, and 10 centuries of inherited tradition, ceased to exist as operational fighting forces. Their names were removed from the records. whether by the Inquisition as part of the broader suppression of the Pale Wasting's history, or because the chapters themselves were so thoroughly eliminated that there were no survivors to carry the records forward, or both, is unclear. But they are gone. 11 sets of chapter colors that are no longer worn. 11 homeworlds that no longer have space marines defending them. 11 apothecary stocks of gene seed that were not recovered and implanted into successor generations. Oh, 11 legacies of courage and sacrifice absorbed into the silence that the Pale Wasting left behind it. The only chapter to survive the campaign was the Nova Marines. Not survive cleanly, not emerge triumphant with their casualty rolls intact. Survive. Be the ones who remained when the others were gone. And they survived not because they were the most powerful or the most numerous or the most perfectly suited to this particular enemy, but because they were the ones who managed to actually end it. Whatever they did, whatever the final act was that stopped the Pale Wasting from continuing its spread, the Nova Marines did it. There is an inscription in the Imperial Palace on Terra, a stone slab, a stele, mounted in a place of honor, praising the Nova Marines for their service during this campaign, as it is one of their earliest recorded battle honors. The text of the inscription praises the chapter and credits them with having, in the exact recorded phrase, by their mortal sacrifice and unmatched valor, unmade that which cannot die, and so preserved the most holy realm of mankind. Unmade that which cannot die. Sit with those words for a moment, because they are doing an enormous amount of work in a very small number of syllables. The phrasing is not killed the enemy, it is not defeated the threat, or repelled the invasion. It is unmade that which cannot die, which implies that whatever the Pale Wasting was, conventional killing didn't work on it. You could not simply shoot it to death, or bomb it, or root it, and watch it retreat. You had to unmake it, whatever that means, whatever. And the fact that the records have been so thoroughly purged means we will likely never know exactly what technique or sacrifice or perhaps bargain was required to unmake a thing that could not be killed by any normal means. But the phrasing of the inscription suggests it was not easy or clean. By their mortal sacrifice. Something was given up that could not be recovered. The specificity of mortal sacrifice is worth dwelling on. Space Marines are not mortal in the way that ordinary humans are mortal. They are superhuman warriors who can survive battlefield injuries that would kill any normal person, who are biologically reinforced and psychically fortified and trained to continue functioning under conditions of pain and stress that would reduce ordinary soldiers to incapacitation. But when an inscription on a monument in the Imperial Palace, the most secure and significant building in the Imperium, uses the word mortal sacrifice in relation to Space Marines, it means something specific. It means the kind of death that even a Space Marine's remarkable physiology and battlefield capability cannot avoid or recover from. It means the kind of cost that the chapters who paid it are not here to tell us about. The 11 chapters that were lost. Think about them for a moment, not as statistics, but as what they represented. Each chapter of Space Marines is 1,000 warriors at full strength. But more importantly, each chapter is a library of genetic material in the form of gene seed, yes, but also a library of accumulated experience, battle tactics refined over centuries, or knowledge of specific enemies developed through repeated engagement, rituals and traditions, and institutional memory that represents the distilled wisdom of generations of service. When a chapter is destroyed, all of that goes with it. The gene seed cannot be harvested because there is nobody left to harvest it from, or because whoever destroyed them also destroyed their remains, or because what destroyed them left nothing behind that could be recovered and identified. The names that used to appear in the rolls of the Adeptus Astartes simply vanish from the records, and the chapters that never were become gaps that can never be filled, because the sons that would have carried the legacy forward were never born. 11 of those libraries were destroyed in the Pale Wasting. 11 sets of knowledge and tradition and accumulated wisdom about how to fight and survive in the galaxy. The scope of that loss is almost too large to fully absorb, which is probably why the Inquisition chose to suppress the records rather than preserve them. A galaxy that knew in detail what had been lost in the Pale Wasting, that understood with full clarity what 11 Space Marine chapters being consumed meant in terms of irreplaceable institutional knowledge and genetic legacy. That galaxy might start asking questions about what else could be lost, and how easily.
Okay, I just want to pause here for a second and share something personal, because this is the part of 40k lore that genuinely gets under my skin more than almost anything else in the setting. A lot of 40k's horror is loud, the Hive terror is dramatic, chaos is overwhelming and colorful and in your face about what it is. Even the Tyranids are terrifying in a way you can point at and describe. The Ghoul Star's horror is quiet. It is the horror of a locked door that nobody remembers locking, and everyone is too scared to open. And the thing on the other side has apparently been waiting long enough that it stopped knocking. The Pale Wasting in particular does something to me every time I come back to it. 11 Space Marine chapters gone and the survivors wrote nothing down. That silence feels more honest than any official record could. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
And whether the things in the Ghoul Stars were really as contained as the Death Spectre's vigil was meant to suggest. Better, the reasoning presumably went, that nobody know the full extent of it. Or better that the Pale Wasting be a half-remembered catastrophe from a troubled era than a vivid and detailed testament to how badly the galaxy can go wrong when the things beyond the safe borders decide to move. Even more unsettling is what happened after the campaign. The Nova Marine's own chronicles, the internal records kept by the chapter itself, are completely empty of any reference to the Pale Wasting. This is not the Inquisition's doing. This is the Nova Marines themselves, deliberately not writing down what they saw and did. A chapter of Space Marines chose not to record one of their most significant battles. The only evidence that the Nova Marines fought in this campaign at all is the stelae in the Imperial Palace that they did not author themselves. They have never claimed the honor of surviving the Pale Wasting. They have never referenced it in communications with other chapters, never used it as a recruitment story, never brought it up in the kinds of ceremonial contexts where battle honors are traditionally displayed and celebrated. Whatever happened during the Pale Wasting, whatever the Nova Marines did to unmake that which could not die, they have decided as a chapter that they would rather the universe forget they were involved. Consider what that means for a Space Marine chapter. Their culture is built on honor, on the celebration of great deeds, on the recording and commemoration of battles that define the chapter's character, that proved its worth, that demonstrated to the universe and to themselves what they were capable of. Yet a Space Marine who survives an apocalyptic conflict and decides not to write it down is a Space Marine who has seen something that made the survival feel less like a triumph and more like a responsibility. The responsibility to ensure that nobody asks too many questions about what was encountered, because the answers would not provide comfort. The Imperium's response to the Pale Wasting told its own story about how seriously they took the threat. They initiated a new Space Marine founding, the 13th founding, called the Dark Founding because of the unusual secrecy and circumstance surrounding it, and created a chapter whose entire purpose was to stand watch over the Ghoul Stars and ensure that whatever had come out of there before would never come out again. The Death Spectres. Yet an entire chapter of warriors with a single mission: guard the border. Make sure the gate stays shut. Be the wall between the nightmare that lives in those dying stars and the rest of the galaxy that does not know, and perhaps cannot bear to know, exactly what it is being protected from. Section 5. The Thexians, the Shapeshifters. Nobody talks about among the species. Native to the Ghoul Stars, the Thexians are perhaps the most insidious, precisely because they are the least conspicuous. They do not announce themselves with crystal fortress cities floating in toxic atmospheres. They do not telegraph their presence through armies of shambling, flesh-hungry metallic monstrosities. They are subtle, patient, extraordinarily skilled at being present in a space without appearing to occupy it. The Thexians, also known as the Thexian elite, as hail from a cluster of worlds deep in the Ghoul Stars region known as the Blood Moons of Thex Prime. The name conjures exactly the image it intends to: iron-oxidized worlds, their surfaces running red with mineral deposits that give the landscape the color of ancient blood, lit by the cold and distant light of stars that are old enough to have developed a degree of dignified resignation about the whole burning and dying process. These are not pleasant worlds by any standard of measurement. They are harsh, chemically aggressive environments that would require significant technological investment to make habitable for most species. The Thexians, naturally, consider them home. What is known about the Thexians biologically is limited but significant. Or they are described as bimorphic, which is a clinical way of saying they can take two distinct physical forms, potentially more, depending on circumstances. When operating in a diplomatic or social context, which is apparently most of the time, because the Thexians seem to regard direct confrontation as something of a failure state, they presumably present a form capable of meaningful interaction with other species. When that guile is insufficient, when they cannot talk or manipulate their way out of a situation, they have what their records describe as a battle form that is characterized in the surviving documentation as quite horrifying to behold. The exact nature of this battle form is not well documented. What little description exists suggests that the transition between the social form and the battle form is not a subtle shift, but rather a dramatic change in physicality that the Thexians' opponents typically find deeply disturbing even before any actual combat begins. But the combat form is, in a sense, the least concerning thing about the Thexians. Combat is manageable. Combat is something the Imperium has developed an enormous institutional apparatus to deal with. The thing about the Thexians that makes them worth an entire section in this exploration is not their capacity for violence, but their capacity for infiltration. The Thexians are masters of manipulation. Not in the vague, metaphorical sense in which that phrase gets applied to cunning politicians or clever generals, but in a very concrete and literal sense. They have worked themselves into integral positions within multiple alien civilizations simultaneously. Species like the Borlak, the Loxatl, and the Nikasa, sapient civilizations with their own histories and political structures, and presumably their own sense of self-determination, have apparently been infiltrated at such a deep structural level that the Thexians effectively occupy key roles in those societies without being recognized as a foreign presence. The exact mechanism by which this is achieved is unclear. It may be that their bimorphic nature allows them to literally assume the physical appearance of the species they are infiltrating. Or it may be that they have psychic or chemical capabilities that allow them to establish trust and authority with other beings in ways that bypass normal critical thinking. It may be some combination of the two, or something else entirely. What matters is the implication. The Thexians are numerically quite small. They comprise only about 15% of the population of their own trade empire, the rest being made up of client species under their dominion. A species that small maintaining control over so many others through force alone would require an enormous military commitment. The Thexians do not appear to rely on force. They rely on being where power is, making themselves indispensable, and ensuring that when the species they are embedded in makes decisions, those decisions serve Thexian interests. But it is an approach to interstellar dominance that bypasses the need for armies entirely and substitutes something far more efficient and far harder to counter. The simple fact that you cannot fight an enemy, you cannot identify. The connection between the Thexians and the Pale Wasting is officially described as speculative. The imperial documents note that the Thexians may be the threat behind the Pale Wasting, carefully preserving the kind of scholarly uncertainty that leaves the subject open for reinterpretation. But when you consider the phrase, unmade that which cannot die, alongside what we know about the Thexians' infiltration capabilities, something clicks into place with an uncomfortable precision. What if the Thexians had spent centuries or millennia quietly embedding themselves in human frontier societies, including the lost human civilizations of the Ghoul stars? Before the Pale Wasting began, they would have had access to those civilizations from the inside. The plague-like spread of the pale wasting, consuming world after world with no warning and no apparent vector, could be explained if the agent of destruction was already present on each world before anyone knew the pale wasting was coming. Not an invading army sweeping in from outside, but a fifth column already embedded in the population, waiting for the signal to shift from trusted infrastructure to active destruction. And then there is the issue of the death spectres, who were specifically charged after the pale wasting with monitoring the Ghoul stars for, as among other things, the Thexians. The fact that a Space Marine chapter is assigned the specific ongoing task of watching a particular alien species tells you something about how seriously the Imperium takes the long-term threat they represent. The Thexians were not simply beaten and forgotten. They were assigned a dedicated watchdog. Someone at a very high level of Imperial governance looked at what the Thexians had done and concluded that the appropriate response was permanent, comprehensive surveillance rather than the more typical Imperial approach of launching a crusade and reducing the threat to slag. Which suggests, perhaps, that the crusade approach was considered and rejected. Not because the Thexians were too powerful to fight, though the pale wasting suggests that might also be true, but because fighting them may not be the solution when you cannot always be certain who is actually a Thexian. When your enemy might already be inside your institutions, inside your planning sessions, inside the very military force you are trying to build to oppose them, the question of how to win becomes considerably more complicated. Section 6. The Scythor Fiends, crystal death that won't stay dead. Of all the species catalogued in the Ghoul stars by the Imperium, the Scythor Fiends are the ones that come with the most documentary evidence, possibly because they were considered the most immediately and consistently threatening, and also because an entire Space Marine crusade was launched specifically to destroy them within living memory of the 41st Millennium. The official Imperial classification for the Scythor Fiends is Homindae Crystallis. You can feel the taxonomy straining to contain what it is being asked to describe. Humanoid, crystalline. These are the two properties the xenobiologists managed to commit to paper before, presumably, they encountered too many additional properties that didn't fit any existing taxonomic framework. The Scythor Fiends have spindly limbs and elongated, vile faces. They are humanoid in roughly the sense that the term applies to any bipedal being, with a recognizable head-torso-limb arrangement, which is to say, not very humanoid at all once you see the specific details. Yet the faces in particular are described in ways that suggest the shape is familiar enough to read as face, but the contents are wrong in ways that the human nervous system picks up on before the conscious mind can articulate what exactly is disturbing about the arrangement. They lived in fortress cities, not on the surfaces of planets, but in the atmosphere of a gas giant. Their homeworld, as designated by Imperial cartography, was the planet 9836-18 Grave Core, a mid-sized gas giant with a toxic and extremely cold atmosphere, described by High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars, who would later personally lead a crusade to destroy them, as closely resembling the planet Neptune in the Sol system. In this toxic and frigid atmosphere, the Scythor Fiends had constructed platforms that hung in the gas layers at whatever altitude supported their civilization, and on those platforms, they had built fortress cities of sheer walls of glimmering crystal. The imagery is extraordinary. Vast crystalline spires rising from floating platforms suspended in the upper layers of a blue gas giant under the distant light of a dying sun. The crystal refracting and scattering that pale light into geometric patterns that no human eye was ever meant to interpret. The Death Spectres, the chapter assigned to watch the Ghoul stars, knew the Scythor Fiends better than any other Imperial force. And the Death Spectres, whose entire existence is devoted to understanding and containing the threats of the Ghoul stars, us were on record as believing that the Scythor Fiends were not alive as humans would understand the term. That is a remarkable statement from warriors who deal with alien life regularly enough that they have refined the concept of alien to a clinical precision. Not alive as humans would understand the term. Something about the fundamental biological or physical process of the Scythe or Fiend's existence defied the normal framework for understanding life. They moved, they acted, they built and fought, and apparently pursued goals. But the underlying mechanism of their existence was sufficiently foreign to human understanding that the best the Death Spectres could do was note that alive might not be the right word. Their weapons were, in keeping with the crystal motif, deeply unusual. The Scythe of Fiends employed small silver discs as their primary armament. When activated, the mechanism of activation is unknown. These discs shattered apart and reformed almost instantaneously into clouds of deadly crystalline shards that moved with directed, lethal intent, slashing at throats and soft tissue with an efficiency that suggested the shattering was not random, but controlled. The pieces of the disc could become very small, moving through gaps in armor and into the spaces between structural elements, and those pieces appeared to retain something of the Fiend's own essence, as if the weapon were not merely a tool, but an extension of the being using it. A piece of the Scythe Fiend itself, weaponized. Every probe, every scout team, every intelligence-gathering mission the Imperium sent into Scythe or Fiend territory. None of them came back. Not the automated ones, not the expendable ones, not the heavily escorted ones. The Scythe or Fiends were not merely hostile in the way that most alien species are hostile to Imperial incursion. They were thorough. They did not allow for survivors who might carry information about their disposition back to Imperial planners. Whatever they did to the teams the Imperium sent into their space, they did it completely. The Death Spectres eventually attempted their own major offensive campaign to destroy the Scythe or Fiends. A large-scale assault, as large as the chapter could mount given their isolation and the perpetual need to maintain their watch across the entire Ghoul Stars region. They pushed into Scythe or Fiend territory, expecting to find resistance. Instead, they found empty worlds. While the fortress cities were still there, the crystal structures still refracting the pale light, the platforms still floating in their gas giant suspension, but the Scythe of Fiends themselves were simply absent. Gone. Not dead, not evacuated in any conventional sense. Gone, as if they had never been there. The Death Spectres concluded from this that the Scythe of Fiends had technology capable of what they called evasion from attempted extermination. The specific nature of this technology remains unclear. Warp-based teleportation is one possibility, though the behavior of the Scythe or Fiends doesn't match known warp-jumping profiles. Phase technology, the kind that allows certain beings to temporarily step outside normal space-time, is another. As the Eldari texts later consulted by rogue trader Janus Drake, who encountered a Scythe or Fiend on a Blackstone fortress, a meeting we will return to, describe the Scythe or Fiends as using their own advanced technologies to evade the Black Templars' crusade. Whatever those technologies were, they allowed an entire civilization to simply vanish from the known universe and then come back once the pressure had passed. Because that is exactly what happened. After the Death Spectres campaign, when the chapter had concluded that the Scythe or Fiends were gone and pulled back to resume their broader watch over the region, the Scythe or Fiends eventually returned, slipped back into their crystal fortress cities, resumed their incomprehensible existence in the toxic atmosphere of Grave Core, and continued being the Scythe or Fiends as if nothing had happened, as if an attempted genocide were merely a temporary inconvenience, the galactic equivalent of being asked to leave a room for a few minutes while it is cleaned. This cycle repeated. When High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars declared the Ghoul Stars Crusade in 990 M41, his force drove deep into the region with genuine military momentum, exterminating Scythe or Fiend populations on the outlying systems with the kind of focused brutality that the Black Templars do better than almost anyone. 8 years of campaign, 8 years of driving deeper and killing everything they found. By the time the crusade reached Gravecore itself, prepared for the final engagement, the fortress cities were silent. The Scythe or Fiends were gone. Again. Disappeared. And exactly as they had when the Death Spectres came for them, leaving behind only their stunning crystalline architecture and the faint luminescence it produced under alien starlight. Helbrecht tried to destroy the planet. He unleashed an exterminatus action on Grave Core, the kind of planet-killing measure that the Imperium reserves for situations where orbital bombardment simply isn't enough. And here, the story gets even stranger. The planet resisted it, a gas giant which should have no meaningful structural integrity against the weaponry the Imperium brings to bear in an exterminatus action, managed to shrug off the attempt. The Death Spectre's captain on the scene, Narush, remarked that whatever the Black Templars did to Grave Core, it wouldn't matter in the long run. The Scythor Fiends, he said, always returned to reclaim their worlds. As a statement from a man who had been watching these beings for his entire life, who represented a chapter that had been watching them for centuries, it carries the weight of experience and the exhaustion of someone who has stopped trying to find permanent solutions to a problem that apparently doesn't have any. The crusade ended without resolution. A distress call from Armageddon pulled the Black Templars away to deal with the return of the great Ork warlord Gaz-G'Kul, and the mystery of the Scythor Fiends was set aside for another day. It has never been fully investigated. The Scythor Fiends, as far as the most recent records suggest, have been seen as far away as the Segmentum Pacificus, Janus Drike's encounter on the Blackstone Fortress, placing one of them thousands of light years from their supposed home region. They are not dead. Oh, they are not gone. They are wherever they have chosen to be, possibly spread through the galaxy in ways that nobody has fully mapped, waiting with the patience of something that has survived more attempted extinctions than the beings trying to exterminate it have had generations. Section 7. The Bone Kingdom of Drazak, a kingdom of the unliving and unmourned. If the Scythor Fiends represent the kind of alien horror that unsettles through its sheer otherness and its refusal to play by the rules of conventional conflict, the Bone Kingdom of Drazak represents a different kind of horror entirely. Drazak is not alien. The things that live there were once members of a species that was itself once mortal, organic, biological. The horror of Drazak is the horror of what a being becomes after it has given up everything that made it alive in pursuit of something that turned out to cost more than anticipated. The Necrons are among the most ancient sentient beings in the Milky Way. 60 million years ago, they were the Necrontyr, a species of biologically frail, short-lived beings who chafed against the limitations of their organic existence and made a catastrophic bargain with the star gods known as the Citan. The Citan offered them bodies of living metal, bodies that would not age or decay or sicken, bodies that could not be killed by anything so mundane as biology. In exchange, they transferred their consciousness into these bodies and became the Necrons, the undying, the metallic, the sleepless. For 60 million years they have persisted in this form, and sleeping in their tomb worlds, or waging war against species that arose after their long dormancy began, ancient and indestructible, and carrying within their metallic chests the echo of an organic existence that is now so distant as to be almost unimaginable. But some Necrons carry something else, a curse, the Flayer virus, bequeathed to the Necron race by the Citan Landugor the Flayer, who was not, like the other Catan, merely shattered and enslaved, but was apparently completely destroyed by the Necrons during their rebellion against the star gods. Even as Landugor died, it cursed the beings who killed it. The curse manifested as a viral infection in the Necron neural substrate, a deeply wrong desire in beings of living metal to reclaim the organic flesh they had surrendered. A hunger for blood and meat and the sensation of biological existence, something that their metal bodies cannot satisfy, but that their corrupted code keeps demanding. Flayed ones, as the afflicted are called, are driven to kill organic beings and wear their flesh, not eat it. They have no digestive systems, no mouths, no biochemical processing for organic material. They wear it. They drape themselves in the skins and organs of the beings they kill, pressing the biological matter against their metal bodies in a futile attempt to feel what they remember. Other Necrons are deeply disturbed by the flayed ones. In a society of beings who have largely abandoned organic sentiment and operate with varying degrees of cold, metallic rationality, The flayed ones represent a catastrophic malfunction. They are irrational. They are unpredictable. They cluster on battlefields not because tactical doctrine directs them, but because they smell blood, and they cannot be fully directed or controlled because their fundamental programming has been corrupted beyond the ability of most cryptechs to repair. Other Necrons exile them, quarantine them, try to destroy them. The flayed ones that escape exile and destruction drift into a sub-dimensional pocket reality, a red and lightless place where they wait until they sense the presence of violence and blood and organic suffering, at which point they tear back into normal space and fall on whatever is providing the stimulus. There is, in the Ghoul stars, a world called Drazak, and Drazak is populated almost entirely by flayed ones. The official designation, the Bone Kingdom of Drazak, tells you something about the state of the place. The streets are lined with bones. The flayed ones that inhabit this world have no particular interest in architecture, urban planning, agriculture, or any of the civic activities that characterize Necron tomb worlds operating closer to their original programming. They have interest in flesh and in fighting each other over the remnants of flesh. They stalk through streets that were once, presumably, the orderly thoroughfares of a functional Necron settlement and are now strewn with the biological detritus of countless raids, fighting over gobbets of rotting meat and shards of bone in the language of the official records. When there is no more flesh to fight over, when the last piece has been shredded too small to grasp or has rotted past the point of recognizable biological matter, they fight each other. Necron versus Necron. Metal bodies grinding against metal bodies in a parody of the organic competition they dimly remember, sustained by something that is not hunger, because they have no biological hunger, but that functions exactly like hunger in its capacity to make them miserable. There is one Necron on Drazak who has not succumbed to the Flayer virus. One being in this kingdom of madness who retains his faculties, who has not given himself over to the endless, futile loop of killing and wearing and decaying and craving more. He is known as Valgul, the Fallen Lord. He rules from a throne that has been constructed, or perhaps assembled, or perhaps accumulated, from the bones and tanned skins of beings who did not survive the attention of his subjects. His one remaining functional eye surveys this kingdom with something that the records describe as an uncertain mix of duty and madness, and the fact that those two things are uncertain, that it is genuinely unclear whether Valgul stays on Drazak because he feels responsible for the wretches under his command, or because whatever madness infected them has infected him in a different and more subtle way, is one of the more quietly haunting details in the entire Ghoul Stars catalogue. He maintains control through the only thing that motivates flayed ones, the promise of more flesh. Every few solar months, when the available organic material on Drazak has been consumed or has rotted to the point of uselessness, Valgul announces a time of bounty and dispatches the fleets of Drazak to raid nearby worlds. As these fleets do not seek resources in any conventional sense. They do not look for minerals or fuel or technology. They look for living beings. They descend on inhabited worlds, organic civilizations and human settlements alike, and harvest. They take what they came for and they return to Drazak. And for a while, the streets run with fresh material, and the flayed ones of the Bone Kingdom cease fighting each other long enough to pursue the object of their deepest, most corrupted desire. And then it runs out again, and the cycle begins again. The Sautek dynasty, one of the larger and more organized Necron political entities, actively works to prevent the expansion of Valgul's Bone Kingdom into the eastern fringe. Even among Necrons, Drazak is regarded as a problem, not just because the flayed ones are a military liability, or because the Flayer virus represents a genuine health threat to any Necron who comes too close, but because Drazak represents something about what the Necron race can become when the fragile structures of civilization and purpose and remembered identity are stripped away by an ancient curse, and the result is not dignified. The The Necrons of the great dynasties, for all their cold imperious calculation, do not want that held up as the mirror of their nature. There is a deeper layer to the Drazak story, one that emerged from the novel series Twice Dead King. The records of the Bone Kingdom describe Valgul as having been there, ruling from his throne of bones, for apparently as long as anyone can remember. But the events of those novels follow a Necron overlord named Oltix, who begins dismissing Valgul as a myth on the grounds that no Necron could maintain sanity after contracting the Flayer virus. Events conspire to force Oltix to lead his dynasty, heavily afflicted by the Flayer curse, to Drazak. He travels through a subdimensional path called the Ghost Wind, the same dimension the Flayed Ones use to move through space. And when he arrives at Drazak, he finds it empty, waiting, as if specifically waiting for him to arrive and sit on its throne of bones. As if the role of Valgul the Fallen Lord is a recurring one. As if the throne waits not for a specific individual, but for whoever arrives last, and loses their eye and takes up the burden of ruling the world of the mad undead. Whether Valgul is a single continuous entity who has somehow persisted across impossible spans of time, or a title passed from one broken Necron to the next, or whether Oltix genuinely travelled backward through time and became the original Valgul, the records remain deliberately ambiguous. The Bone Kingdom does not offer clean answers. It offers only the rhythm of absence and bounty, the creak of metal limbs through streets of old bones, and the cyclopean gaze of a king who may be the sanest being in his domain, or may be the most profoundly lost. Section 8. The Death Spectres, guardians at the edge of everything. To understand the Death Spectres, you first have to understand what it means to be assigned a post with no end date, and no relief rotation, and no expectation of anything other than continued vigil until the universe itself calls time. The Death Spectres were created in the 13th founding of the Adeptus Astartes, known as the Dark Founding for reasons that speak to the unusual and secretive circumstances that surrounded it. The 13th founding was initiated specifically in response to the Pale Wasting, the Imperium, having lost 11 Space Marine chapters to whatever came out of the Ghoul stars, decided that the appropriate response was to create new chapters dedicated to ensuring it could never happen again. The Death Spectres were among those created, and unlike many newly founded chapters who were assigned to specific sectors or given broad deployment mandates, the Death Spectres were given a single, narrow, permanent mission: watch the Ghoul stars. Guard the border between that region of space and the rest of the galaxy. Ensure that the inhabitants of those dying star systems never again ascend to threaten the wider galaxy. They are a successor chapter of the Raven Guard, sharing the genetic mutations that characterize their primogenitor legion. The Raven Guard mutation that the Death Spectres carry most visibly is the failure of their melanchromic organ, which should regulate skin and eye pigmentation in response to environmental stimuli, but in Raven Guard's successors simply doesn't work as designed. The result is that all Death Spectres are albino, complete absence of melanin pigmentation, corpse-white skin, and eyes that run blood red. They also lose their hair during the gene seed implantation process, though some manage to retain it. The visual effect of a Death Spectre in the field is striking in a way that suggests their gene line perhaps did not find this mutation unwelcome. Warriors in black armor, white-faced and red-eyed. Appearing from the darkness of a region most Imperial forces are deeply reluctant to enter. Their chapter colors and heraldry are appropriately decorated with imagery of death and transcendence, skulls and scythes rendered with a precision that suggests not grim affectation but genuine philosophical commitment. They are psychically gifted, the chapter placing significant emphasis on its librarians and the use of psychic capabilities in both combat and the ongoing watch over the Ghoul stars. In a region where conventional sensors are unreliable, where warp travel is hazardous, and where some of the inhabitants operate on principles that defy mechanical detection, having warriors who can perceive threats through non-technological means is not merely useful but potentially critical. The Death Spectre's librarians, and over the long generations of the chapter's existence in the Ghoul stars, have developed forms of psychic perception calibrated specifically to the region's unusual properties. The ability to sense presences that exist partially outside the normal parameters of the warp, to detect the wrongness that precedes certain kinds of Ghoul stars phenomena before conventional instruments register anything amiss. This expertise is not written down in any document that leaves the chapter's possession. It is passed from senior librarian to apprentice through direct instruction, carried in the minds of the living rather than archived in databases that might be captured, copied, or interrogated by parties the chapter does not trust. The chapter's homeworld is Occludus, a world whose name suggests something deliberately concealed, and something kept from view. It is a cemetery world, a planet whose primary social and cultural function revolves around the dead, covered with the monuments and mausoleums and ritual sites of a civilization that measures its relationship to the living by the care it extends to the memory of those who are gone. Under a cemetery world surface, in the catacombs and deep burial chambers that characterize such places, the death specters have built their fortress monastery, not in towers that pierce the sky, not in fortifications visible from orbit, buried, hidden, part of the culture of preservation and concealment that characterizes a world whose existence is itself partly a monument to things that are over and partly a vigil over things that will never quite be done. Oh, the recruitment process the death specters use is worth its own consideration, because it tells you everything about what the chapter needs from its warriors. The chapter identifies young humans from their breeding populations and brings them through the standard rounds of Space Marine selection, the physical trials, the psychological assessment, the gradual gene seed implantation. But before a Death Spectre's aspirant is considered ready for full initiation, there is a final test. They are required to die. Not in the performative sense of some ritual near-death experience designed to produce psychological impact. Actually die, and then resurrect themselves through willpower alone. The chapter believes, and has the empirical record of 7,000 years to support the belief, that a warrior who has died and chosen, through the force of their own refusal to accept it, to come back, is a fundamentally different kind of warrior from one who has never faced the permanent dark and turned away from it. The Space Marines, who make it through this process and join the chapter's ranks, have already answered, in the most visceral way possible, the question of whether they are willing to pay everything to continue. They said yes. At the cost of their own lives, they said yes. This makes a promotion system that would otherwise seem darkly comic almost reasonable in context. If a Death Spectre wants a higher rank, they do it again. They die and come back again. The chapter's leadership is composed entirely of warriors who have answered the final question more than once. But the most extraordinary fact about the Death Spectres, the one that requires a moment of quiet consideration before it fully registers, is the glass throne. The Shariaks, in the Occludan dialect that the Death Spectres have developed over millennia of isolation, is a throne of glass that sits at the heart of the chapter's fortress monastery on their homeworld of Occludus. When a new chapter master, called the Magir, the first Spectre, takes his position, he does not simply assume command and begin directing the chapter's operations. He sits on the Shariaks, and once he sits on it, he does not stand up again until he is dead. The glass throne kills him. Slowly, over the course of his tenure, it drains his life away while granting him psychic power and awareness of a kind that is, apparently, vital to maintaining the chapter's watch over the Ghoul stars. Exactly what the glass throne does, or how it works, what the mechanism is by which it converts a chapter master's remaining life force into whatever form of protection or perception it provides, is one of the most tightly held secrets in the Death Spectre's possession. The wider Imperium does not know the glass throne exists. This is also an extraordinary fact. An entire Space Marine chapter, nominally loyal to the Imperium of Man and subject to its oversight, has kept this secret from the governing bodies of the Imperium for over 7,000 years. The High Lords of Terror do not know what keeps the Death Spectres at their station. The Inquisition, which has fingers in almost every institutional secret of the Imperium, does not have this information. the Adeptus Mechanicus, who are deeply interested in unusual or powerful artifacts of unknown function, have not been told. Only the Death Spectres themselves know, and they have maintained this silence with the absolute discipline of warriors who understand, perhaps better than anyone else in the Imperium, the price of the thing they are protecting everyone else from. Because someone on the chapter's founding decided that this was necessary. Necessary enough that a chapter master must agree, upon being elevated, to spend the rest of his shortened life sitting on a throne that will kill him in service of something that he cannot fully explain to anyone outside his chapter. Necessary enough that 7,000 years of chapter masters have made this choice, none of them having done so in ignorance. Necessary enough that when the Death Spectre's current chief librarian, Athiocodatus, effectively runs the chapter while the Megir is occupied with dying on his throne, everyone understands that this is how it has to be and how it will continue to be. What exactly would happen if the glass throne went empty? Nobody is saying, but the chapter's behavior strongly implies that the answer would be very bad. That without whatever the Shariax provides, the watch over the Ghoul stars would become something other than the ongoing, unbroken vigil it has been for 7 millennia, and whatever is held back by that vigil would no longer be held back. In a galaxy full of tragedy, there is something particularly affecting about the Death Spectres. They are not celebrated, and they do not receive the kind of recognition that the Ultramarines or the Space Wolves or the Blood Angels earn through their high-visibility campaigns. Most Imperial citizens have never heard of them. Most Imperial Guard regiments fighting their own brutal wars across the galaxy have no idea that a chapter of warriors is spending their endless service in the cold outer dark, bleeding their chapter masters to death on a glass throne to keep those dark stars quiet. The Death Spectres accept this because accepting it is part of the mission. As one of their apothecaries said, in one of the few recorded statements from the chapter that has made it into the broader Imperial literature, you give up your humanity that the citizens of the Imperium may keep theirs. Pity or despise them, but never expect them to understand. Section 9. Exiles and Survivors. The ones who stayed. The Ghoul. Stars have produced not only alien horror, but a particular kind of human tragedy. The story of those who went into the darkness and could not, or did not, come back. Of those who remained in the cold outer regions and were changed by what they found there, becoming something that does not quite fit the categories of loyal or traitor, because the categories themselves were designed by people who had never spent 10,000 years beyond the edge of the map. The Ashen Claws are the most fully documented example of this phenomenon. Their origin story begins in the Great Crusade, when the Primarch Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard Legion was consolidating his forces and dealing with the complex legacy of his legion's early history before he was found. The Raven Guard had been among the legions that fought under the command of the War Master Horus before the Emperor reunited with his sons. And some of those pre-discovery warriors, the Terran veterans of the 18th chapter in particular, carried habits and attitudes from that earlier service that Corax did not find compatible with his vision of what the Legion should be. The specific breaking point was the Battle of Gate 42 in a campaign cluster called the Acum Sothos. The survivors of that engagement, who had apparently engaged in practices, likely involving the treatment of civilian populations or enemy combatants, that Corax judged as unacceptably brutal, even by the standards of a legion that was itself not exactly gentle, were gathered together and given a choice that was not really a choice. They were sent northeast into the outer darkness to bring the light of the Emperor's great crusade to the Ghoul stars. This was not framed as a punishment exactly. It was framed as a mission, an assignment, a deployment. But the subtext was clear. Go, and do not expect to return, and perhaps do not expect anyone to be waiting for you if you do. There were roughly 4,000 of them when they left, in 13 capital vessels and a score of frigates. They were still out there when the Horus heresy ignited. They're isolated beyond the edge of the Imperium, receiving increasingly confused and desperate communications from a galaxy tearing itself apart. They had to make a decision about which side they were on in a conflict they could not directly participate in. They chose, in the end, neither. They refused to serve Horus. They refused, more specifically, to serve the Emperor directly either. Korax's obvious contempt for them had made the bond of loyalty more fragile than it might otherwise have been. They fought the Night Lords when those traitor Legion elements were in the region, which was perhaps the most clearly aligned choice in an otherwise complex moral situation. And then they went quiet, disappearing from Imperial records, becoming a historical footnote, plus a crusade fleet that went into the northeast and never came back and was eventually given up for lost or dead. They were neither. They were the Ashen Claws, and they were exactly where they had always been. 10,000 years later, they survive on a world called Atargatis Prime, in a chapter-sized force that has been changed by 100 centuries of isolation in the most dangerous region of the galaxy. They are not what they started as. The culture has evolved in response to the realities of survival in the Ghoul stars, where the human population is sparse, and the threats are constant, and the Imperium's institutional infrastructure is not merely distant, but completely absent. The Ashen Claws fight what they have to fight. They raid when they have to raid. They are described as vicious, as willing to engage in slavery of a kind, yet as holding human life considerably more cheaply than a codex-compliant chapter would. And yet, they have also adapted in ways that work against that characterization. The scarcity of humans in the Ghoul stars means that individual human lives have value as recruitment fodder and as labor and as gene seed source material, which creates a kind of pragmatic protectiveness that from a distance can look almost like care. In fact, by the 41st millennium, the Ashen Claws' relationship with the human population of Atargatis Prime had evolved significantly from their origins as conquerors turned reluctant shepherds. The local tribes of Atargatis had begun to align themselves with different factions within the chapter, participating directly in the chapter's politics and operations. A human woman ruled the world alongside the chapter master. Whatever brutality marked the Ashen Claws' early history in the Ghoul stars had been worn down over millennia into something more complex. A society where the boundary between the superhuman warriors and the ordinary humans they nominally protected had become genuinely blurred, where the categories of protected and protector had merged in the specific pressures of surviving together in conditions that made everyone's survival dependent on everyone else. This evolution is remarkable in the context of space marine culture. Chapters are, generally speaking, deeply separated from the human populations they recruit from and protect. The transformation is too great, the gap in capability too profound, the difference in lifespan too extreme for the relationship to be genuinely equal in most circumstances. Yes, the Death Spectres maintain breeding worlds full of humans they regard as stock. Most other chapters are more solicitous than that, but the fundamental asymmetry remains. The Ashen Claws, through 10,000 years of isolation and shared survival, had apparently managed something that almost no other chapter had managed. A genuine integration with the human communities they were embedded in. The galaxy had not granted them the luxury of maintaining comfortable separateness. And in losing that separation, they had perhaps gained something in terms of basic humanity that their more orthodox brothers had traded away without entirely noticing. The Carcharodons know they exist. They are perhaps the only significant Imperial force that does, and the relationship between the two chapters, the Carcharodons, who patrol the extreme outer reaches of the galaxy in a perpetual void war of their own, and the Ashen Claws, who hold a corner of the Ghoul stars through sheer survival instinct, is one of the stranger ongoing arrangements in the Imperium. They trade. Gene seed flows one way, technology and recruits flow the other. The negotiations are apparently tense enough that they have occasionally devolved into violence, with Chapter Master Tiberos of the Carcharodons once winning a duel with the Ashen Claws Chapter Master Nehat Nev and claiming 2 ancient lightning claws as his prize, weapons that, according to whispered speculation, may have originally belonged to the Raven Guard's 18th chapter when they were first exiled. carried for 10,000 years through the darkness and only finally lost to a blade and a grudge. However, what the Ashen Claws represent, stripped of the specific details of their history, is something the 40,000 universe returns to again and again. The question of what loyalty means when the thing you were loyal to is not there, when the institutions that defined your purpose have moved on without you, when the mission you were given was a slow execution disguised as a deployment. They are not chaos-touched. They do not serve the ruinous powers or work toward the galaxy's destruction. By the standards of their own moral calculus, they are still doing the Emperor's work, fighting the enemies of humanity in a region where no other Imperial force was willing to stay. But the Imperium would still likely classify them as renegades, and not without reason. It's because 10,000 years of unsupervised operation in the Ghoul stars has produced warriors whose methods would be unrecognizable and probably unacceptable to the governing bodies of the civilization whose name they technically still serve. The Carcharodons themselves are a separate and related story. Their own history is obscured by the same kind of deliberate mystery that surrounds so much of the Ghoul Star's record. The Forgotten One, the Void Father, the Day of Exile that the chapter's own legends describe without ever clearly identifying who exiled them or why, or what the sacred duty to travel the spaces beyond the Imperium's borders actually consists of. On their gene seed shows characteristics of Raven Guard stock, with additional mutations that suggest either long-term genetic drift in extremely harsh conditions, or a chimeric origin involving more than one legion's genetic material. The Ashen Claws, who perhaps know more about the Carcharodons' origins than the Carcharodons do themselves, apparently consider them traitor-born in some sense, mongrel descendants of something the Raven Guard would rather not have claimed. Both chapters persist. Both fight in their remote and largely unacknowledged way, in conditions that would break chapters with more institutional support and shorter supply lines. Both have been changed by the Ghoul Stars into something that is still, at its core, Space Marine, but Space Marine filtered through 10,000 years of isolation, resource scarcity, and constant contact with the worst that the galaxy's most terrifying region has to offer. Section 10. What the Galaxy Does Not Know. The Deeper Silence. We have talked about the known threats of the Ghoul Stars, the catalogued, partially understood, sufficiently documented horrors that have forced the Imperium to acknowledge them and deploy resources to contain them. But the things we know are, almost certainly, the smaller portion of what is actually there. Consider what we are actually working with in terms of information. The Death Spectres have been in the Ghoul Stars for roughly 7,000 years. They are a chapter of at most 1,000 Space Marines, covering a region that, in galactic terms, is enormous. Their vessels patrol the borders and the shallower reaches. The deeper interior, the truly interior, of the heart of the dead star systems far beyond any navigational safety margin, is terra incognita in the most literal sense. Unknown ground, and the evidence strongly suggests that whatever is in there, the Imperium has made a collective decision at the highest levels that it is better to not know. The Ghoul Stars have a way of doing things to living things that pass through them. The evidence of this is most dramatically illustrated by the Tyranid splinter fleet that appeared near the border world of Orask in 977 M41. A splinter fleet of the eastern Tyranid hive fleets, having travelled through some portion of the Ghoul Stars, fell on the Orask system and was beaten back, but not before inflicting devastating casualties that ran into the tens of thousands within a matter of solar days. Well, what was notable about this force was not merely its ferocity, but its condition. The fleet was described as disoriented and twisted by its passage through the Ghoul Stars. Tyranid organisms that had entered the Ghoul Stars as part of a coordinated swarm intelligence emerged from it wrong, changed by what they had passed through, bearing modifications that the hive mind had not intended, and that seemed to push the individual organisms toward a frenzy that went beyond even normal Tyranid aggression. The Ghoul Stars did something to the Tyranids. Something about that region, some combination of its physical conditions, and whatever forces or entities have shaped it over the millennia affected even the adaptive genius of the Tyranid hive mind. The hive mind is, in its way, at the most sophisticated adaptive intelligence in the galaxy. It processes information from billions of individual organisms and adjusts in real time, incorporating the genetic solutions to every problem it encounters. And when the Tyranid fleet emerged from the Ghoul stars, it was disoriented, off balance, wrong. That is not something that happens to the Tyranids under normal circumstances. That is something that requires an environment that specifically breaks rules, that the Tyranid adaptive framework is not equipped to handle. Then there is the matter of the Black Templars' Oparian Crusade, which entered the Ghoul stars in M42 and has not been heard from since. This was not a small force. This was an entire Black Templars' crusade, an organized military deployment of hundreds of Space Marines under a dedicated crusade command structure, and carrying the chapter's crusading spirit into one of the most dangerous regions of the known galaxy. The records note that many believe they still continue fighting onward, which is the kind of phrasing that politely declining to say that they have all died would use without quite saying it outright. An entire crusade, gone. Into the Ghoul stars, which, it is worth remembering, have never returned anything that has gone deep into them. And there is the Aeldari's silent record. In 818 M35, the Asuriani, the craft world Eldar, the ancient and psychically gifted navigators of the galaxy who can perceive events across vast distances through their connection to the warp, recorded a Ghoul star supernova. A star in the Ghoul stars went nova, which in any other context would be a celestial event worth noting and moving on from. The Aeldari found it significant enough to write down. Why? What was notable about a stellar explosion in the Ghoul stars? The Aeldari have witnessed countless stellar events across their long history, and most of them don't make it into the records. This one did. Which suggests that either the star that went nova was significant for some non-astronomical reason, or the explosion produced effects that the Aeldari's seers found worth documenting, or both. The Aeldari know things about the Ghoul stars that they have not shared with the Imperium. This is not unusual. The Aeldari rarely share anything with the Imperium unless it serves their own interests directly. But it is worth noting that in the case of the Scythor Fiends, and it was Aeldari texts that provided the closest thing to an explanation for how the Fiends managed to evade the Black Templars' crusade. The Aeldari have an archive of information about the Ghoul stars and the things that live there, compiled over their own ancient and long history, and they have not opened that archive to any significant degree. Whatever they know, they have decided it is better that others do not. Consider also what the Orks themselves might know. The premise of this exploration is that even the Orks do not venture into the Ghoul stars, or at least venture significantly less frequently than their ubiquity across the rest of the galaxy would predict. Orks follow war wherever it exists. They have empires and domains in the galactic north and south and east and west, in the Eye of Terror's backyard, or on worlds so hostile that other species wouldn't attempt colonization under any circumstances. And yet the Ghoul stars sit largely free of the greenskin presence that has managed to infest almost everywhere else. Why? The Orks cannot articulate fear in any sophisticated way, but they have instincts. Their mech boys and weird boys operate on intuitions that are harder to explain than the straightforward bellicosity of the average Ork boy. Intuitions about what is dangerous and what is merely challenging in the way that Orks find all things challenging. When enough greenskins have ventured into a region and failed to come back, failed not in the sense of having a good fight and dying honorably, but failed in the sense of having simply vanished without any ripple of violence reaching back to be retold and celebrated, the collective Ork unconscious eventually gets the message, not in words, not in a strategic assessment, but in the way that herding animals avoid places where predators have been found before, in the inexplicable aversion that develops when enough of your kind have gone somewhere and none of them have come back to brag about it. The Ghoul stars have consumed enough Ork explorers, enough roving bands and advanced scouts and lone prospectors looking for new worlds to fight over. that even the greenskins have acquired an instinctive reluctance. They do not know what is in there. They could not tell you. But somewhere in the distributed, psychic, biology-driven network of Ork consciousness, there is a note that says, not there. Something over there does not fight the way things should fight, does not respond to violence with the reciprocal violence that gives the whole exercise meaning, does something that even the green and battle-hardened hindbrain recognizes as deeply and fundamentally wrong. And Orks, who live for the fight, who want nothing more than a worthy opponent to test themselves against, apparently cannot find in the Ghoul stars the kind of opposition they are looking for. What they find instead is something that does not give them that satisfaction, something that either removes them without engagement or defeats them in ways that provide no return in the currency that makes Ork existence worthwhile. There is a broader implication to all of this that deserves explicit statement. The Ghoul stars are not merely a dangerous region. They are a region that has somehow acquired, across geological and galactic timescales, the ability to shape and resist and occasionally consume the most powerful and adaptive forces the galaxy contains. Tyranids adapted by millions of years of evolution are twisted by passage through it. Orks driven by the most fundamental biological imperatives in the universe avoid it. The Imperium, possessing the single most powerful military and industrial apparatus in recorded galactic history, maintains a cautious and perpetually underfunded watch at its borders, rather than launching the kind of sustained campaign that usually characterizes Imperial responses to existential threats. Whatever the deepest interior of the Ghoul stars contains, whatever is in those systems so far inside that no expedition has ever returned, whatever shapes the physics and affects the psychologies of everything that comes near it, it is something that the known universe has not yet found a way to categorize. Something that was there before the Imperium existed, that was there before the Eldar rose to galactic prominence, that may have been there since the war in heaven left its scars on the fundamental structure of the Milky Way. Something old and quiet and content, apparently, to be left alone. But that responds to intrusion in ways that even the most battle-hardened and fearless species in the galaxy have learned to respect. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But in the extreme northeast, where the dying stars cast their pale and insufficient light over worlds from which all life has been carefully removed, there is something that transcends even that. There is only silence, and the things that make the silence their home. Section 11. The Quiet Now. What AM42 tells us. The 42nd millennium arrived with a galaxy already tearing at its seams. The cicatrix maledictum, the Great Rift, the scar torn across the galaxy by the catastrophic forces that surrounded the fall of Cardia, changed the shape of the Imperium fundamentally. The warp bled into real space with a permanence that previous incursions had not achieved, plunging half the Imperium into a darkness of failed communication and warp storms, and fundamentally altering the conditions under which every spacefaring civilization in the galaxy operated. The Indomitus crusade of the returning Primarch Robut Guilliman attempted to push back against the worst consequences of this fracture, but the galaxy that Guilliman's forces were trying to reconnect was not the same galaxy it had been before. And in this context, the Ghoul stars became even more isolated. The Great Rift's effects on warp travel were catastrophic throughout the galaxy, but in regions already on the edge of navigational viability, the consequences were worse. For the Death Spectres, already operating beyond the Astronomican's reliable reach, already navigating by instruments and experience, and the kind of instinctive warp sense that develops over generations of void travel in difficult conditions, the rift represented a significant complication to an already demanding mission. The Deathwatch garrison of Fort Pickman, which supplements the Death Spectre's watch over the Ghoul stars, has continued its operations. Kill teams of Deathwatch Marines, drawn from dozens of chapters and specialized in the exact kind of Xenos threat that the Ghoul stars produces, rotate through Fort Pickman on assignment, dealing with incursions, investigating anomalies, and maintaining the broader understanding of the region's evolving threat picture that the Death Spectre's broader strategic watch requires. The Death Watch's involvement suggests that the Ghoul stars are treated, at the institutional level of the Ordo Xenos, as an ongoing and active concern, rather than a historical threat contained by the Death Spectre's perpetual vigil. There is, in M42, the matter of the Oparian Crusade. Black Templars, the same chapter, whose High Marshal Helbrecht launched the crusade against the Sith or Fiends that ended so inconclusively in 998, M41, sent another crusade into the Ghoul stars, the Oparian Crusade. It went in the early years of the 42nd millennium, and it has not come back. The broader Imperium has filed this under "they are probably still fighting," which is the charitable reading. The less charitable reading is that an entire crusade of Black Templars, among the most combat-capable warriors the Imperium produces, walked into the same darkness that 11 Space Marine chapters walked into during the Pale Wasting, and the Ghoul Stars did what the Ghoul Stars have always done to forces that go deep enough. We should also note that the Scythor Fiends, yet despite being officially declared nearly exterminated by Helbrecht's campaign, and by Death Spectre's operations before that, have continued to appear in the wider galaxy. The encounter on the Blackstone Fortress in the Segmentum Pacificus, half a galaxy away from their supposed home region, tells us that whatever technology allowed them to evade extermination also allows them to distribute their presence across enormous distances. A Sith or Fiend in the Segmentum Pacificus is not an anomaly or a stray. It is evidence of deliberate movement, of a species capable of reaching out beyond its containment zone and placing agents or representatives or explorers or something without a clean analogue to any of those categories. At strategic locations, the Scythor Fiends appear to be moving, slowly perhaps, and over the timescales that a species that is not alive as humans would understand the term, might consider appropriate for a major relocation or expansion. But moving. And the Eldari texts that describe their technology as capable of evasion did not say temporary evasion, the kind that a desperate species employs when cornered and then reverses once the pressure eases. They implied a more fundamental capacity, the ability to exist in multiple states or locations, to vanish from one context and appear in another, in ways that make conventional military eradication not merely difficult, but perhaps conceptually impossible. The Thexians, for their part, have presumably continued operating in exactly the way that makes them so difficult to counter, quietly through the bodies of other species, yet in positions of influence within civilizations that do not know they have been occupied. The death toll of the Pale Wasting suggests that when the Thexians do choose to move openly, or whatever the Pale Wasting constituted in terms of open action, the scale is extinction level, but the Thexians appear to prefer patience. 10,000 years of quiet, watchful, deeply embedded presence in the galaxy's most remote region is consistent with a species that measures time in geological eons and regards the current millennium as a relatively brief interval in a much larger strategic picture. Drazak keeps bleeding. Every few months, the fleets launch. The worlds nearest to the Bone Kingdom are raided, and the cargo of biological material returns to Drazak to be distributed among the Flayed One's endless futile hunger. At the neighboring civilizations that have not already been stripped of their populations have apparently either moved or made their own arrangements for survival in proximity to a Necron kingdom that regularly goes harvesting. This is one of the details of the Ghoul Stars that somehow captures something about the place that more dramatic horrors do not. The ordinary grinding tragedy of worlds that exist in the shadow of Drazak, not destroyed but regularly bled, not conquered but perpetually subject to the announcement of a new time of bounty with all the helplessness that announcement implies. And through all of this, the Death Spectres sit on their glass throne. Chapter Master after Chapter Master has climbed onto the Shariaks and given their remaining years to the Watch, are dying in service of a secret so complete that even their closest allies within the Imperium do not know what they are protecting everyone from. They recruit from the worlds within their small, protected sphere of influence, inducting young humans into the chapter's rites, including the remarkable tradition that aspirants must die and then resurrect themselves through willpower alone before they can be considered for full initiation, a test that filters for the exact kind of stubborn refusal to yield that long service in the Ghoul Star's demands. They mummify their honored dead and place them in catacombs beneath their fortress monastery, maintaining a communion with those who came before that speaks to the weight of the continuous vigil they all share. They do not ask for recognition, they do not receive it. Yet they are the ones who ensure that whatever lives in the dying light of those old and failing stars does not follow the light outward to where the rest of the galaxy can be found. Section 12. The final question. What is the Ghoul Stars, really? We have spent a great deal of time in the darkness together. We have met crystalline beings who are not alive in any conventional sense, and who build their fortress cities in the cold clouds of gas giants. We have walked through streets of bones on a world where ancient metal monsters fight each other for the remnants of stolen flesh. We have considered the silent testimony of 11 Space Marine chapters reduced to names on a list that nobody can read because the list itself was burned. We have watched Space Marine crusades go northeast and not come back. And we have kept returning to a central question that the lore of the Ghoul Stars raises and does not answer. What is this place, at its root? What is the common thread that connects the Scythor Fiends and the Flayed Ones of Drazak, and the Thexians, and the Pale Wasting, and the Twisted Tyranids, and the absent Orks and the Death Spectres, killing their chapter masters on a glass throne? Here is what I believe the Ghoul Stars represent in the broader context of the 40,000 setting, drawing on everything we have covered. The Ghoul Stars are a region where the normal rules of the 40,000 universe apply, in a more concentrated and less filtered form. Everywhere in 40,000, reality is contested. The warp bleeds through in moments of psychic intensity, demonic incursion, and raw emotional extremity. A physics bends in the vicinity of sufficiently powerful entities. Things that should not work do work, and things that should work sometimes do not. But in most of the galaxy, these anomalies are local, temporary, and capable of being addressed by sufficient application of force or faith or technology. The Ghoul Stars seem to be a region where the membrane between those rules and whatever lies beneath them is permanently thinner, where the residue of the war in heaven, the conflict that permanently altered the physics of the Milky Way galaxy, that introduced the warp as a stable feature of reality by producing enough psychic suffering to feed it, that created the Cetan shards and the Necrons and the Old One's scattered legacy, has never fully dissipated. We're the kind of entities that can only exist in spaces where reality is less insistent on being itself, have found a home and set up permanent residence. The Scythor Fiends are not alive as humans would understand the term, because life as humans understand it is a robust biological phenomenon that works reliably in a universe that follows consistent physical laws. In a region where the physical laws are less consistent, life might work differently, producing entities that are alive in some deeper or more fundamental sense that biological chemistry cannot capture and that human taxonomy cannot adequately classify. The Pale Wasting could simultaneously be a star-spawned plague and nightmare engines, because in the Ghoul Stars, the distinction between biological infection and mechanical warfare might be less fixed than it is everywhere else, and whatever emerged from there was something that could manifest as either or both, depending on what it needed to be. Even the Flayed Ones of Drazak fit this reading. Drazak, that world at the edge of the Bone Kingdom, was the site of an ancient and titanic battle between Necrons and Cetan during the Necron Revolt, the moment when the Necrons turned on their former star god masters and shattered them into shards. The orbit around Drazak is filled with the ruins of hundreds or thousands of Necron warships from that ancient conflict. The planet was reduced to ruins 60 million years ago and has never recovered. That kind of damage to reality, the scale of forces involved in a war between the Necrons and the Cetan, that the sheer metaphysical violence of the war in heaven leaves marks. Whatever is wrong about Drazak, whatever makes it the natural convergence point for the flayed ones and the natural seat for the empty throne of the fallen lord, is connected to the wounds the place sustained in a war that predates human civilization by 58 million years. This is why the Orks don't go there. The Orks' power is fundamentally psychic. Their collective gestalt, their reality-warping belief, their ability to make things work through sheer confident wrongness, all of it is a form of warp interaction that requires a somewhat stable relationship between belief and reality. In the Ghoul stars, that relationship is not stable. The Orks' own nature, the thing that makes them the most successful and adaptable species in the galaxy, becomes less reliable, and less capable of doing what it does, in a region where the rules that it exploits are not consistently available. The Orks do not fear the Ghoul stars in the way that a thinking being fears a known threat. They avoid it the way a compass avoids pointing randomly, because random is what happens when the thing that makes the compass work is not there. The Ghoul stars are a region of the galaxy that is, in some fundamental sense, more ancient than the universe that exists inside it. The structures of reality as we currently understand them in the 40,000 setting, the warp, the material realm, the interaction between psychic energy and physical matter that produces all the marvels and horrors of the setting, these are relatively young. The war in heaven changed everything, and whatever predated that war is buried under 60 million years of aftermath. The Ghoul stars are a place where some of that buried prehistory is closer to the surface than anywhere else. And the things that live there are the things that are comfortable with that proximity. Section 13. The Legacy of Silence. Why the Ghoul stars matter to 40,000. The Ghoul stars have been a consistent presence in Warhammer 40,000 lore since the earliest editions of the game, named on galactic maps and associated with vague menace before specific details were ever attached to them. The specific entities, the Seathor Fiends, Drazak, the Pale Wasting, the Death Spectre's Vigil, were developed across multiple editions and supplements, gradually filling in the geography of a region that Games Workshop clearly intended to remain at least partially mysterious. And that is the genius of the design, if you step back and look at it. The Ghoul stars are one of the few places in a setting that is thoroughly, almost exhaustively documented, where the blank spaces are deliberate. The Imperium sends expeditions in, and they do not come back, not because Games Workshop has not thought about what is in there, but because the most frightening thing a horror setting can do is decline to show you the monster. The Ghoul stars are the 40K universe being honest about the fact that some things should remain unknown, that the power of the suggestion of horror outweighs any specific detail that could be attached to it, and that a galaxy of 100 billion stars still has corners where the best answer to the question, what is there, is, we don't know, and the ones who went to find out didn't come back. There is also something thematically rich about the positioning of the Ghoul stars in the setting's larger narrative. Warhammer 40,000 is, among many other things, a meditation on the costs of empire, on the price of maintaining order against chaos, on the slow and grinding weight of perpetual warfare, on the individuals and institutions that prosecute it. The Ghoul stars and the Death Spectres guarding them represent the most extreme version of that theme. An entire chapter of warriors given a post with no end date, guarding a threat that they cannot publicize or explain, killing their chapter masters on a glass throne in service of a protection so fundamental and so secret that the people being protected do not even know they need protecting. The glass throne, specifically, is one of the most haunting single details in all of 40K's vast catalogue of haunting details, because it is not a glamorous sacrifice. It is not dying in battle, sword in hand, with your battle brothers watching and your chapter's honor upheld. It is dying slowly, sitting still, giving your remaining years to a chair that takes them from you in exchange for whatever it provides to the watch. Every chapter, master who has ever sat on the Shariax has known what they were agreeing to. Every one of them sat down anyway. 7,000 years of chapter masters, each making the same choice, each dying the same slow death, and each doing it for a galaxy that does not know they exist, and a threat that cannot be named in any public forum. That is not a story about power. That is a story about duty in its purest and most unadorned form. The Ghoul stars also matter because they represent the honest acknowledgement within the setting that the Imperium cannot protect everything. That there are places where the mechanisms of imperial governance simply do not reach, where the Astronomican's light fails and the chains of supply and command that hold the million worlds together simply stop. The Ghoul stars are the edge of the map, and beyond the edge of the map, there are things that the map cannot describe, and some of those things are content to stay there, and some of them occasionally look outward at the softer, younger, or more optimistic universe on the other side of the border. The Death Spectres are the lock on the door, the glass throne is the key, and somewhere out there, in the pale light of a dying sun, on a world that no expedition has ever successfully returned from, something ancient turns slowly in whatever space it occupies and regards the distant, tiny, brave light of a civilization that does not know it is being regarded and waits. Closing, the quiet horror. In the end, the Ghoul stars are a story about ignorance, not willful ignorance, not the comfortable kind of ignorance that chooses not to think about unpleasant things, the desperate, hard-won ignorance that is the product of collective decision to not look, because looking has costs, and the thing doing the looking might not survive the experience. Here, the Imperium knows enough to be afraid. It knows enough to maintain a watch, to assign warriors to a post that no one else wants, to burn the records of a conflict that cost 11 chapters and could easily have cost the entire galaxy. It knows enough to describe the inhabitants of those dying star systems as supernatural, and to stop there, because going further requires examining what supernatural actually means when your entire civilization runs on the back of a god who is kept alive on a mechanical throne and worshipped through organized religion as the prerequisite for functioning mail service. But knowing enough to be afraid is not the same as knowing what you are afraid of. The Ghoul stars keep their deepest secrets in the places that no one has come back from. The crystal fortress cities in the toxic clouds of a gas giant. The throne of bones in a world where the dead tear each other apart for scraps. The places so far inside the navigational blackout that even the Death Spectres do not go. Those places hold something. We know it is old. We know it is dangerous in ways that conventional tools and metrics cannot fully capture. We know that even creatures whose whole existence is defined by the love of violence find, in the presence of it, something they cannot categorize as violence and therefore cannot relate to. The Orks, who fear nothing, do not go there. Think about that again. After everything we have explored, the crystal beings, the bone kingdom, the 11 lost chapters, the glass throne and its dying succession of chapter masters, and the crusades that go in and do not emerge, the simplest and most eloquent testament to what waits in the Ghoul stars is the absence of the universe's most fearless species. They know, in their wordless, instinctive, green and violent way, they know. And they have decided that some fights are not worth having. If this journey into the darkness left you wanting more of this kind of quiet, atmospheric deep dive into the places 40K does not often go, then you know what to do. Hit the like button if the Ghoul stars kept you company tonight, and subscribe so you are there for the next time we go somewhere the maps say to avoid. There are a lot of those places left. The galaxy is very large, and it has a lot of corners that are dark for very good reasons. The light is here. The Ghoul stars are out there. Stay close to the light.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.